I was named for an uncle who died in the Spanish Civil War. He had joined the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, the 2,800 or so Americans out of roughly 40,000 foreign volunteers who had come to Spain to defend its new democracy against a military revolt led by the self-appointed Generalissimo Francisco Franco, with the backing of a feudal aristocracy and a hardline Catholic hierarchy. Nearly the last of the Lincolns to die, my uncle became a symbol of their lost cause and of the missed chance to halt the advance of fascism at less than the hellish cost the world would soon have to pay. In my family, his story loomed large, but stayed sketchy, since we were not in the habit of discussing painful subjects. In the fall of 2021, however, I took a trip to Spain and a Spanish Civil War tour of Barcelona, and through my tour guide, I learned about a grape farmer who owns land near where my uncle died and has taken a personal interest in his story. I wound up driving into the part of Catalonia known as Tarragona to meet up with José María Álvarez Crua and a British expat and student of the Civil War named Alan Warren. Here they are, trying to pinpoint the location where my uncle set out on his last patrol in September 1938. Here is José María in his farmhouse, which he has turned into a museum of the collected remnants of the nearby combat. Meeting José María and Alan set me to work finding out all I could about James Phillips Lardner. His father, my grandfather Ring Lardner, was a newspaper columnist as well as a writer of short stories, and he built whole columns out of the loosely transcribed breakfast table chatter of his 4 sons. Jim, the second oldest and second from the left in this portrait, was the quietest and least demanding. When birthdays were coming, the others, my grandfather wrote, would plead for a pony or a sailboat or a parrot or something else they ain't got no chance of getting. But the second boy is different. When we asked him what he would like for his birthday, he said he would like something to clean the rust off his bicycle. My father, Ring Jr., known as Bill, was the third in line, and they hung together enough to be addressed as a joint entity named Jim and Bill. My uncle was bookish and nearsighted like the rest, with, according to my dad, a striking gift for math and puzzle solving, and a mind that seemed to operate from logic alone. He was at the same time the only athlete of the bunch. At Harvard, before he dropped out halfway through his junior year, Jim played rugby and lacrosse and wrestled his way to the title of New England Intercollegiate Champion in his weight class of under 148 pounds. And though he came across as painfully shy, I have correspondence documenting a secret relationship with a young actress and family friend involving back-and-forth visits to New York and Cambridge during his college days. He got to Spain by way of Paris and a job as a reporter at the International Herald Tribune. Big things were happening in Europe, but the Tribune was essentially a gossip sheet for American visitors and expatriates, and as Jim sourly observed in a letter to his mother, my grandmother Ellis Lardner, his editors kept him busy interviewing celebrities or rewriting resort pamphlets, Baedeker's accounts, and encyclopedia articles, so that our tourist advertisers will continue to advertise. In March of 1938, he decided to take his annual vacation in Spain, intending to write a series of stories about the war and the American volunteers. He had secured a first-class escort. At the Gare d'Orsay, he met up with Ernest Hemingway, who had been a friend of my grandfather's, and there on the platform, Hemingway introduced him to another Spain-bound writer, Vincent Jimmy Sheehan, who, without Jim's knowledge, was being sent to Spain by the Tribune's parent newspaper in New York. "One of you has to decide who is the chef de bureau," Hemingway said, "since you're both from the Herald Tribune." It was a crummy joke under the circumstances. Jim would be writing for a Danish newspaper and an American wire service, with only a vague promise from his Tribune superiors to look at anything he might submit. Sheehan was a star foreign correspondent, almost as big a shot as Hemingway at the time. According to Sheehan, though, the three of them spent their train ride in high-spirited conversation, fueled by copious draughts of whiskey from Hemingway's flask. Jim, Sheehan said, had taken the liveliest interest in Spain for at least a year past, and knew a good deal more about the geography of the war and some of its leading characters than I did. The trip was a tremendous event for him, Sheehan added, an embarkation on perilous seas where he had obviously wished to roam. In Perpignan, near the border, Hemingway went off to purchase supplies and see about getting a car to the frontier and beyond. After lunch, they departed in a vehicle loaded with food, cans of gasoline, and whiskey and cigarettes. In Barcelona, they set up shop at the Majestic, the shabby but friendly hotel of choice for foreign correspondents. Jim got a room without a bath and became a regular user of Sheehan's bath. The war news was not good. The rebels or nationalists had been supplied with troops, tanks, bombers, and fighter planes by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The defenders of the Republic or loyalists had pleaded for help to the Western democracies, but Britain and France had retreated behind a non-intervention pact, which they, unlike Germany and Italy, took seriously. The United States' attitude was similar. It would, of course, scrupulously avoid any interference in the unfortunate Spanish situation, said Secretary of State Cordell Hull, articulating a policy that turned out to entail an unprecedented ban on the sale of weapons to an elected foreign government, yet somehow did not prevent Ford and GM from selling trucks to the rebels on credit, or Texaco from voiding a contract with the government and becoming a major supplier of oil to the Franco side. The only countries that sent arms to the Loyalists were the Soviet Union and Mexico. In the early going, the Loyalists had stunned the world with their citizen resistance, and the first stream of volunteers had played a key role in preventing the seemingly inevitable capture of Madrid. But in early 1938, an army of 150,000 nationalists had swept east to the Mediterranean, splitting Loyalist-held Spain in two. After his credentials had been vetted, Jim made his way to the front. He was on a bridge with one of Spain's top generals, Enrique Lister, during a bombardment by Italian planes, and he got an interview which he turned into a long story. A good story, Sheehan assessed it, but one, he added, that got edited away to nothing by the Tribune, causing Jim to lose his zest for the occupation of war correspondent. That was more or less when he decided to enlist. Nobody else thought much of this idea. I sat up all night trying to talk him out of it and failed, Hemingway said. Sheehan, who felt personally implicated in Jim's decision, worked extra hard to talk him out of it. In a book about the fascist threat and the Western reaction, Sheehan recalled thinking that the Loyalist prospects were bleak at this stage, and that my uncle, with his sorry eyesight, was not military material. But nothing could put that boy off once he had made up his mind, Sheehan concluded. The International Brigade authorities also tried to discourage him. The brigades were no longer actively recruiting, and it took Jim nearly 2 weeks to talk his way into what was described as a new multinational artillery unit being put together in Badalona, 7 miles up the coast. Before setting off, Jim persuaded Sheehan to take custody of his books, which included works by Lenin and Shakespeare and an illustrated guide to the fighting plains of the world. Just about the last thing he did was write a letter explaining what he was doing and why. Although he addressed it to his mother, his letter was also in the nature of a memo to self. He laid out a list of reasons, 16 in all, including these: Because I believe that fascism is wrong and must be exterminated, and that liberal democracy, or more probably communism, is right. Because in my ambitious quest for knowledge in all fields, I cannot afford in this age to overlook war. Because I need something remarkable in my background to make up for my unfortunate self-consciousness in social relations. Because I think it will be good for my soul. Because there is a girl in Paris who will have to learn that my presence is not necessary to her existence. Because I want to impress various people, Bill for one, Bill being his brother, my father. Because I want to know what it is like to be afraid of something, and I want to see how other people react to danger. He had weighed the arguments against enlisting, such as that I might get seriously wounded or killed, and that I shall cause you, that is his mother, many weeks of worry. But I am sorry for your sake, he said, that they are not enough to dissuade me. If you still consider me one of your sons, he added, you can send me an occasional letter and possibly a package now and then. Anything edible would be appreciated. Milk chocolate or raisins or anything in cans that does not require preparation. About a week after his departure, Jim unexpectedly reappeared at the Majestic in Barcelona, looking dirty and unshaved. "What the hell are you doing here?" Sheehan said. "I thought you had enlisted in the army." "I did," he replied, "but I'm a deserter now." He explained that he had hitchhiked and tramped his way back from Badalona after realizing that he had been assigned not to an artillery unit as promised, but to a group of deserters and soreheads, or maybe prisoners. "It's hard to tell," he said. "All we do is lie around on some dirty straw and answer a roll call twice a day." He had returned to Barcelona to clean himself up and pester his way into a legitimate fighting unit. Sheehan, putting the pieces of the story together later, ascertained that Jim had been placed in a holding pen for inutiles de guerra, cowards, thieves, and others deemed unfit for service. The brigade commanders, Sheehan theorized, had decided, let's take him since he seems so determined, and send him somewhere back of the lines where he won't be in any danger. His name is famous in America, and will have the propaganda value of his enlistment without risking his life. They were probably as startled as I was to see Lardner turn up again, Sheehan said. They probably thought they had settled the Lardner problem for the duration of the war by parking him harmlessly at Badalona. This time he got what he was after, assignment to the Lincoln Battalion, which, following the massive retreats of March and April, was regrouping along the banks of the Ebro with the other English-speaking units of the 15th International Brigade. Like Sheehan and Hemingway, Jim's comrades-to-be had doubts about him. Elman Service, who had interrupted his undergraduate studies at the University of Michigan to fight for Spain, remembered him on arrival as quiet and looking so like a dude. Pale face, we were all deeply tanned, horn rims, beret, brand new khaki clothes, and a new knapsack and canteen. A volunteer named Yale Stewart saw him avert his eyes from the sight of a rabbit being clubbed to death, its neck broken and blood oozing from its mouth and ears, en route to the cooking pot and the dinner table. Jim spent his first weeks learning to handle a rifle and a light machine gun and going out on practice maneuvers. Along the way, according to Edwin Rolfe, a volunteer who was also a poet and who wrote a book about the Lincolns, he slowly relaxed, made friends, and was soon completely accepted. Elman Service and John Murrah would become his best friends in the battalion, and both had stories to tell about his acculturation process. Service's story involved a volunteer named Bill, who weighed about 200 pounds, was all festooned with muscles, and liked to wrestle, as he put it. Service was about Jim's size. He had been one of Bill's victims, and he expected the worst when Jim's turn came. But to Service's astonishment, Jim dumped Bill hard in 1 second, and when Bill demanded a do-over, boom, he's on the back of his neck again, Service said. Oh boy, that did me good. Mura was struck by Jim's visible discomfort with rough language. Prudishness ran in the family. My father, in a memoir, recalled that he and Jim had had a month's allowance docked for introducing the following side splitter at the dinner table. What's the longest slide in the Bible? When Joshua went from Jericho to Jerusalem on his ass. Jim had an unusual gift for self-transformation, however. As a teenager, he had decided one day that he didn't like his posture, and according to my dad, he straightened himself up, sort of thrust his chest out, and held himself that way from then on. When Mura decided to give Jim a crash course in proletarian manners, he proved to be a quick learner. On the 4th of July, the brigade celebrated with a series of athletic competitions, speeches, and a holiday dinner in the town of Marsa. The Lincolns arrived singing a marching song that Jim had written for the occasion. While the other units got a ride to the festivities, the Lincolns made most of the journey on foot. Set to the tune of Tit Willow, Jim's lyric was adapted from a Spanish soldier's ditty entitled Up o Ayado, a military corruption of the first 4 Spanish numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4. His version ended with this quatrain: "Oh, we don't give a damn for a ride in a truck. If the others get carried, it's just their hard luck. For as long as we're marching, we don't give a," singing Upo and Upo Ayado. His superiors thought well enough of him to put him in charge of a machine gun squad and send him to a school for corporals, or Cabos. While there, he wrote an article on the duties of the job for the brigade newspaper, the Volunteer for Liberty. A Cabo, he said, must maintain the fighting spirit of his men at a high level and bolster their courage in action by reminding them of what a fascist victory would mean to Spain and to the world. He must work for better relations between internationals and Spaniards, between Catalan and Castilian, between soldiers and civilian. He should make himself a guardian of the crops and other property of the civil population. Sheehan visited the Lincolns in mid-June. He found them camped out in some stables near the village of Cervera on the Barcelona-Lerida road. Jim, he said, wore a very dirty khaki shirt and a pair of collarless trousers that were torn and ragged. His feet were in canvas alpargatas, sockless. I asked him what had become of all his fine clothes from Barcelona. They were too fine, he said. He had given them away one by one. Sheehan had expected him to be an outlier in a brigade that contained, as he said, some prize roughnecks. His appearance of diffidence and caution had not promised well for the company in which he now found himself, Sheehan wrote. But I was wrong from the word go, he added. Jim had blossomed out into one of the favorite characters of the battalion. He seemed superbly well and cheerful, happier in the battalion, Sheehan judged, than he had ever been out of it. Letters were a big deal in this army of volunteers from far and wide. Most of Jim's letters went either to my father, who was in Hollywood carving out a career as a screenwriter, or to my grandmother in Connecticut. He wrote to her often, always with affection, sometimes addressing her as Mother Darling. Although I don't have her side of the correspondence, some of what she was saying and thinking comes through in his. "You asked me how long I enlisted for," Jim wrote in early June of 1938. "There's only one way of enlisting, for the duration of the war. I don't mean to be cruel, but it is better that you should resign yourself to my being in Spain indefinitely. But a good soldier is hard to hit," he added, "and I am going to be a good soldier." She was raising a more sensitive issue than he let on. Some of the brigaders had assumed, as my grandmother possibly did, that a volunteer was free to unvolunteer. Others had signed up without giving that question any thought. Few had previous military experience. and they were up against an enemy with an edge not only in weaponry, but in inhumanity and indifference to Geneva Convention-style rules of war. The soldiers of Franco's Army of Africa and its Spanish Legion had learned their trade in the brutal suppression of a rebellion in Morocco. Hitler and Mussolini used Spain as a testing ground for their latest tanks and planes and methods of instilling terror. Whole towns were destroyed to give German commanders some hard data on the destructive power of their Stuka dive bombers. Captured Loyalist soldiers were often lined up and shot. Alan Warren took me to one of the sites of these mass executions, outside a grape growers' cooperative in the town of Gandesa. The Internationals, used as shock troops in the most dangerous situations, died at 3 times the rate of the regular Spanish forces, and desertion, or talk of desertion, was common. After a period of leniency, the brigade had by early 1938 come around to treating it as a capital offense. Shortly before Jim joined the Lincoln Battalion, a volunteer named Paul White fled north in a stolen ambulance. White was shell-shocked after fighting at Belchite, one of the Loyalists' worst defeats. He longed to be home in New York City with his wife, who was pregnant at the time. On his way to the French border, though, White had visions of the disgrace he would be visiting on his family and his child-to-be, and he turned around. Eventually, he reported back to his company expressing remorse and readiness for duty. The next morning, White was executed along with 2 fellow deserters. His buddies were horrified, and the brigade commanders, realizing they had gone too far, announced a fresh change in policy. There would be no further executions of deserters. Jim would have known about this episode, but there's no mention of it in his letters. No talk of bad food, stinky latrines, or lice, either. His letters to his mother are upbeat and matter-of-fact. "Don't worry, I'm fine," he is saying. But she wasn't fooled. "This summer is going to be hell," she wrote in a letter to one of her sisters. "I get through the days, but the nights are awful." In the same letter, she described Jim as a strange combination of ruthless logic and romantic idealism, adding, "I don't think anything justifies fighting." She had been against America's involvement in the First World War, but I am proud of him for doing what he thinks right. In reconstructing my uncle's life, I have been stirred to think harder about hers. Her husband, my grandfather, had died at the age of 48 of tuberculosis and the ravages of alcoholism. After Jim's death, many people, including a few men with matrimonial intentions, tried to coax my grandmother out of her grief and isolation, my father wrote in a book about his family, but those efforts pretty much ceased in October 1944, when a landmine blew up the jeep in which her youngest son, my Uncle David, was traveling across Belgium as a war correspondent for the New Yorker. A few years later, a third son, my father, would be blacklisted and sent to prison for refusing to cooperate with a congressional investigation of supposed subversion in Hollywood. Communism was another topic on which Jim felt a need to correct his mother's thinking. In a letter he sent in early July, he urged her to ignore the voices which you have heard your share of, making communists out to be dirty, bomb-throwing foreigners, etc. He might have added, but did not, that he was now a communist himself, a newly registered member of the Communist Party of Spain. Also, "I think you were unfair to Soviet Russia," his letter continued. "Since neither of us has been there, we have to take the words of others as to conditions among the people. And since almost no one who goes there is neutral, these opinions are inevitably slanted. What seems clear," he said, "is that economically the masses are now, after much suffering, decidedly better off than they were before the revolution." He acknowledged that there may not be the same kind of freedom of speech and press as in the United States, but you have to remember, he said, that the Russians are carrying through a project which was generally considered impossible when they started. This one is a tough read. Knowing what we know about the hundreds of thousands of people, including formerly lionized revolutionaries, who had been executed, imprisoned, or sent to Siberia at the behest of a dictator obsessed with threats to his rule, on top of the millions of Ukrainian and Russian peasants systematically starved to death for not taking kindly to collectivization. What was he thinking? What were they thinking, I should say, my uncle and many others at the time? Not that much, as best I can tell, about what was going on far away and largely beyond their comprehension in Russia. More, I suspect, about the Depression as damning evidence of the immorality and unsustainability of capitalism, and about the rise of fascism. My father had joined the American Communist Party, the Hollywood branch. In a memoir written 6 decades later, he recalled a habit he had come to regret of treating every piece of antagonistic writing about the Soviet regime with automatic skepticism. The Soviet Union was, he said, obviously a dictatorship, and he was troubled by the deification of Stalin, along with the startling number of Bolsheviks confessing to conspiracies against the party or the state. But then again, no one I knew wanted to see the same formula applied in our country, my father wrote. America, we were convinced, would become socialist with all its freedoms intact. Although a year younger than Jim, he had been the more political of the two. He had helped spark Jim's interest in Spain and in fascism, which my father regarded, I'm quoting from his memoir again, as the last refuge of a minority intent on maintaining a system which can no longer provide enough work and enough bread for the people. The Depression and fascism were the big realities. Communism was more of an abstraction, and on that level it seems to have appealed to my uncle's logical mind. In his party sign-up form, he listed some of his recent reading. It included The Daily Worker, L'Humanité, Frente Rojo, and Muchos Selecciones de Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin. Communism had a human face for him, too, but it was not the face of Stalin, it was that of the communists he had come to know. In a letter to an ex-girlfriend written from Paris, where Jim had been reading The New Masses in copies forwarded by my dad, he described the party members he had met in France as friendly, honest, tolerant, and good-humored. I am beginning to feel the same kinship with the communists, he said, that I used to feel with newspapermen as a group apart from the rest of the world. The international brigades had begun spontaneously. Some of the first volunteers were tourists and students and athletes who had come to Spain for a People's Olympiad, conceived in opposition to the 1936 Olympics in Berlin. Since that time, however, the brigades had been run by the Comintern, the Soviet-led alliance of the world's communist parties, and Moscow had supplied, along with weapons, a cadre of party operatives charged with the dual mission of imposing needed military discipline and letting the other elements of the Spanish left know who was boss. But Jim had had little contact with these apparatchik types, and he had come to Spain too late to have witnessed the brutal Soviet-ordered purge, recounted by George Orwell in Homage to Catalonia, of the anarchists and anti-Stalinist communists who had gone to war with the fanciful idea of attempting to build a more egalitarian society at the same time. The communists in my uncle's orbit were rank-and-file volunteers, drawn to Spain, like him, by a sense of their moment in history, and by values and beliefs that, if openly expressed and acted on in the Soviet Union, would have been a sure ticket to the Gulag. I can say this with confidence, because the Gulag, loosely speaking, was the fate of all too many of the international brigaders who wound up in Russia after the Spanish Civil War, either by choice or because they had nowhere else to go. In America, communists would soon be called dupes, traitors, and foreign agents, but they had become a major force in the struggles for workers' rights and racial justice, and in Spain they were the mainstays of an extraordinary multinational effort to preserve democracy and confront the threat of fascism. The Internationals were gearing up for a last-ditch offensive. The goal was to divert Franco's army from a drive toward Valencia and keep the conflict going until, as Hugh Thomas wrote in his History of the War, the general situation in Europe exploded. Then surely, Thomas said, France and perhaps Britain would be drawn into the Spanish War as the Republic would be drawn into theirs. But the plan kept getting postponed. 2 or 3 times we have set off with full equipment, presumably headed for the front, Jim reported on July 13th in a letter to my father, but each time it has been a false alarm for one reason or another. Alan Warren took me to the place, between the towns of Garcia and Ascó, where the brigade finally set out on July 25th, 1938. At first in boats, later on a catwalk bridge of barrels and planks, they crossed the Ebro, established a beachhead, and advanced inland, all in blistering heat and under combined fire of artillery, air bombs, and strafing, according to Alva Bessie, who was with them. In the hills above the river, the Internationals captured the towns of Flix, Mora, and La Fattarella, today the site of an exhibit dedicated to the foreign volunteers, and the Battle of the Ebro, as it became known. It was my uncle's first taste of combat, and perhaps, as Sheehan wrote, his experience bore some resemblance to that of the protagonist of Stephen Crane's Red Badge of Courage. The untried man, who believed in something enough to fight for it, doubted, up to the crucial moments, his own ability to do so, but discovered in the end that he could stand it as well as the next one, or even better. After those early victories, Jim was assigned to the escort detail taking 200 prisoners back across the river. At the end of a long, food-deprived march, he headed for an orchard to investigate rumors of edible fruit. He found some unripe pears and apples and peaches, which were better than nothing, he said in a letter to his mother, but my attention was soon distracted by one of the frequent duels between anti-aircraft guns and bombing planes. The small, round, white puffs of smoke where the shells explode keep appearing all around the bombers. Sometimes, he said, the shells hit and a plane comes down. More often, the planes fly away after dropping their loads. Out there by himself, he didn't sense any personal danger until a munition truck burst into flames several hundred yards away. At that point, Jim decided to take cover, and he was lying on his stomach when a bomb dropped, a little too close, as he put it. Although the explosion and concussion were terrific, he got up, collected his rifle and munition belt, and started back, before he felt pain on his left side and realized that my trousers were covered with blood. It seems the flying shrapnel hit me in the flesh and muscle, picking very soft and fortunate spots. Jim got sent to a hospital in the town of Valls. This place, which had been and is once again a high school. Writing to his mother, he described his injury as nothing serious and just enough to keep me out of action for a few weeks. In a postcard to my father, who was soon to be a first-time parent, Jim wrote that while you are doing your best to increase the tribe of Lardners, there seems to be a counter-revolutionary plot here to thwart your work. They missed this time, fortunately for the People's Army, although I did stop a little flying iron in my eagerness to pick up the bomb and throw it back at the pilot. After a month's recuperation, Jim rejoined his unit in a rocky area near Tortosa down the coast. He was glad to be returning to duty because, he told his mother, there are still some phases of war that I haven't seen. For the Loyalists, the war had reached a desperate phase. They had been driven back across the Ebro, and everywhere we go now, Jim said in one of his letters, it is necessary to dig trenches and/or individual refuges from the shells and bombs. In another letter, dated September 14th, I think, he reported that I didn't get hit, which was a wonder. In the very last of Jim's letters, on September 19th, he said he was suffering from a cold and a little trouble with my stomach, which probably has some connection with the fact that I made a pig of myself yesterday out of other people's packages of food. He had spent 7 hours working through the night in stony ground to make a trench for our protection, until soon after daybreak it was deep enough to sit in with our heads below the surface, and we got in just before the trench mortars began to land. I never was so well paid for hard labor, he said, apologizing for what was not a very cheerful letter. He promised to do better next time. On the 21st, the Spanish government announced that it would be sending the internationals home. Between deaths and desertions, their ranks were badly diminished, young Spanish conscripts outnumbering foreigners in most units by now. Through this gesture, the Republic was hoping against hope to win favor with Western leaders and get them to put pressure on Germany and Italy to remove their forces. Word of the planned withdrawal had reached Jim's company when, the following day, they were ordered to relieve a badly battered unit of Polish volunteers, and they moved into trenches dug by the Poles on a certain Hill 281 near the town of Corbera. Anticipating an enemy attack, Jim's superiors put him in charge of a 3-man patrol that was supposed to contact a force of loyalist Spaniards holding Hill 376. When they reached the foot of what they took to be that hill, they stopped at the sound of digging ahead, and Jim told his companions to stay put while he investigated. Within minutes, the others heard voices. First, a challenge from someone in Spanish, then a reply from Jim in Spanish. After that came a barrage of gunfire and explosions. Elman Service, who had been knocked out of commission by a battle wound, talked to several members of the company later, trying to reconstruct that last night of Jim's life. One of the people he questioned was the lone survivor of Jim's party, a volunteer named Tony Novakoski. He had lain hidden for hours, he said, after hearing enough machine gun fire and bombing to kill a company of men. Since the battalion commanders could not be absolutely sure of Jim's fate, they initially reported him as missing. The uncertainty lasted for a few weeks, until his mother and brothers learned through Hemingway that the Franco forces had found a corpse with press credentials. In a letter written many years later, Service questioned the wisdom of that scouting mission, what with the battalion's imminent withdrawal and the riskiness of approaching a group of Spanish soldiers, friends or foes, in the middle of the night. The scuttlebutt, he said, had it that at least one and maybe 2 teams had been handed the same assignment and had failed, their leaders blamed for lacking the guts to go far enough. This was probably true, Service figured. I remember several people said, "Sure, how in the hell are you going to go up a hill occupied by Spaniards, many of whom were about 16 years old then, and not get killed?" But Jim's superiors had decided that they needed a Cabo they could trust, a courageous one, Service said, adding, "And they found a courageous one all right." My father had been an agent of the political awakening that sent Jim to Spain and into that barrage of machine gun fire. He didn't talk about his brother's death, at least in my hearing, but he wrote and dreamed about it. In a book about his family, he described a recurring nightmare in which I had murdered someone and was trying to escape the consequences. Some nights, he said, the identity of his victim was obscure. Other nights, it was Jim, for sure. A few days after his death, the Lincolns were demobilized in preparation for their return home. The Republic was even now still pleading for the right to buy arms from Britain and France. But the leaders of those countries had other ideas. On September 30th, Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier were in Munich to sign the pact giving Adolf Hitler the go-ahead to finish dismembering Czechoslovakia. After Munich, Stalin lost interest in the Spanish cause and began exploring a non-aggression pact with Hitler, while Germany was emboldened to send fresh arms and supplies to the nationalists. At the end of March 1939, Franco's forces entered Madrid and established a dictatorship that lasted 36 years. Although technically neutral in World War II, Spain supplied Germany with crucial minerals and raw materials, as well as submarine bases and 45,000 volunteers for the Russia campaign. 500,000 Spaniards fled the country after the war, and they had good reason. The nationalist victory was followed by a horrific wave of vengeance and mass slaughter. Hundreds of thousands of loyalists and suspected loyalists wound up in prisons or concentration camps or militarized penal colonies. Tens of thousands were formally executed or otherwise disposed of. Spain is today believed to have as many as 140,000 disappeared people, the modern world's second highest tally after Cambodia. We would remember Franco in the same breath with Hitler and Mussolini if he had not been content to commit most of his crimes against his own people. Over the past decade, Spain has begun, in fits and starts, to recover the memory of its Franco-era atrocities. José María is a believer in this truth-telling enterprise. A portion of the Battle of the Ebro was fought on and around his family's olive and grape-growing land. He has made a hobby of collecting bullets, mines, and other combat bric-a-brac. He tells a story about two young girls raped in 1946 by soldiers of Franco's army, and then taken in by his grandmother. The townspeople reported the incident, he said, but to the disgust of his family, the authorities did nothing. The International Brigaders, by contrast, were remembered, according to José María, for treating the locals well. José María has a notion about erecting a statue of my uncle on a nearby ridge as a memorial to the volunteers. He has put a fuzzy photoshopped version of it on his farmhouse wall. I don't know if this is a serious plan. I trust not. I'm not into giant statues. But I have filled out a form and sent a DNA sample to Memoria Democratic, the organization in charge of excavating an estimated 1,200 mass graves, and where possible, identifying the remains. What would my Uncle Jim have done with the rest of his life if things had gone differently? Bad eyesight and all, would he have found a part to play in the World War to come, or in the great post-war struggles for racial and gender equity, against the war in Vietnam, for environmental sanity? If so, he would have had the repeated pleasure of seeing his fellow veterans of the Lincoln Battalion out there battling with him. One thing is for sure, where he would have been on October 28, 1938, in Barcelona, being feted along with some 13,000 departing members of the international brigades who paraded through streets hung with flags and paved with flowers, with women and children jumping into our arms, calling us sons, brothers. He would have been there to hear Isadora Dolores Ibarruri Gomez, known as La Pasionaria, a tough cookie but one hell of an orator, deliver one of the great send-off speeches. Comrades of the international brigades, she told them. "You can go proudly. You are history. You are legend. We shall not forget you. And when the olive tree of peace puts forth its leaves again, mingled with the laurel of the Spanish Republic's victory, come back." Since he couldn't, I went in his place, and since my return home I have been digging and Googling and scouring the archives for these glimmerings of the 24 years of life he was given.